Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. We talk a lot about horror on this channel, but the real horror out there is how easy it is for your data to fall in the hands of disreputable people. That's why today's video is sponsored by Aura. While you're enjoying today's spooky video, data brokers, those things that go bump on the web, could already be selling your information to scanners, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, your health records, your relatives, they could all be out there. That's why I've been using Aura. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests, just for me. It was simple to use and very intuitive, and I had barely gotten out of the setup process, and it was already blocking over 20 data broker requests on my behalf. Aura protects your passwords, your banking information, everything you need for day-to-day online life. Cleaning up my information not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, but it also protects me from hackers who could use my information to help them access my social media accounts, bank accounts, other sensitive information. Things like a certain YouTube channel that you all enjoy listening to so much. Aura also does much more to protect me and my family from online threats, the kind you can't see. It comes with other features like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more, without having to download several different apps. It really is just that easy to set up, and best of all, I get everything at one affordable price. I hear you saying, but Dr. Plague, I have one or two of these tools already. But, dear readers, not having Aura is like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. Readers of my fine tales can tell you why that never ends well. Aura is always on, doing the hard work of keeping me safe so I can focus on other tasks like finishing my latest book or uploading my most recent video. I value my privacy, and I know you value yours. You can go to Aura.com, that's AURA.com, to start your 2-week free trial. You can also check out the link below and start your free trial with Aura. So why not give Aura a try and protect yourself from the real monsters out there? I'm a little surprised that I'm writing this, since I was never that much into the supernatural. I say not that much because my older sister, Rita, was mesmerized by it. She was 6 years older than me. So most of what she did with her friends in the attic of our garage was a mystery. The garage attic was strictly off limits. They guarded it like an inner sanctum. It wasn't until my mother discovered the Ouija board that I began to understand that something was amiss. We weren't particularly religious, but we did attend church on holidays. My mother went on a tirade when my father got home from work, insisting that my sister was inviting evil spirits into our house. My dad threw out the Ouija board, and later, I picked it up out of the trash and used it for target practice with my brother's BB gun. None of that would have been particularly memorable, except the following night, my sister was babysitting me. Normally, as soon as my parents left, they would call Brenda down the street to come down and split the babysitting money with her and leave. I didn't complain since Brenda was much more interested in my stories than my sister and her friends, but tonight, my sister stayed home and invited her friend Angie over. They told me to stay in my parents' room as they disappeared into the basement. I grew up in the Midwest, and we had one of those old, deep basements. The house was over 100 years old, and the basement was a place that I can only remember visiting maybe once or twice when I dropped some toys into the heating vent, and my dad had to go into the basement and disconnect some ductwork. There were only 2 small windows that were barely large enough for a child to fit through, but way too small for an adult. I remember there was a cold draft, too. There was a brick wall that butted up to the stairs, leading down to the basement that had partially collapsed. I remember looking into that darkness and asking my dad where it led, and he said it led beneath the house. My parents never had to tell me not to go into the basement. I was petrified of it. I think I was playing with toy soldiers in my parents' room when I heard their blood-curdling screams. I don't remember being afraid, but they both came running up the basement stairs and ran straight past me out of the house, slamming the basement door behind them. I was 7 years old at the time. I had no idea why I didn't follow them. I just sat there on the floor with my toy soldiers. And then I heard the footsteps. I thought maybe it was one of my older brothers, Joey, who was down the street playing guitar with his friend Steven. They were always playing pranks. The door to the basement was locked. I could hear the door being pushed. The lock was just a wooden disc my dad had made. When they slammed the door, it had fallen down and locked. I heard it hit the floor when the door burst open. And that's about all I remember. I woke up the next day in the hospital. Later I was told that my sister had run down the street to get my brother, and they said they'd found me unconscious on the floor. The doctor said I'd had a convulsion. That's what I believed for 13 years, at least until last night. My sister Rita went on to become a flight attendant, and my brother Joey, I still call him that, became a DNR officer. We love each other dearly, but because I live on the other side of the country, we don't stay in touch as much as we used to. At least, we don't as often as when I was living in Michigan. I'd flown back from my father's funeral, and we were all reminiscing on my parents' porch. That's when my brother Joey brought up the night that I'd had the convulsion. "He made us swear to never tell you the truth," Joey said, taking a long drag off his cigarette. "But now that he's gone, I guess we can tell you what really happened." I looked over at Rita, thinking this might be a joke, but the look of dread on her face told me that whatever Joey was about to say was not for my amusement. "You sure this is a good idea?" she said nervously. Joey crushed his cigarette out on the wooden bench. "You didn't have a convulsion." Joey leaned in, the flicker of the porch light casting shadows across his face, making him look more solemn than usual. "What happened to you that night wasn't anything medical." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to tell me what had happened. "When Rita and I got back to the house, we found something with you." Joey glanced at Rita, and as if on cue, she said, It wasn't human." My mind went to the rational explanation of a rabid dog or maybe a feral raccoon. They both laughed when I asked if it was an animal. "So what was it?" I said. "It was like a shadow, and it was floating above you," Rita said, her voice barely audible. I laughed and got up to go back inside. "I don't believe in ghosts," I said. "Wasn't no fucking ghost," Joey said, unbuttoning his shirt and showing me a scar on his chest. "You got that when you fell out of a tree," I replied. "I remember you telling me." "No, it's a story we made up. You did that to me," he said, tapping out another cigarette. Nothing in their demeanors suggested this was a prank, but perhaps I'd underestimated their acting skills. "I was 7 years old. There's no way It went inside you," Joey said. He looked over at Rita, who finished his sentence. "It possessed you. I know that sounds horrible, but it wasn't your fault." "This had better be a hidden camera prank," I said, looking around. "You picked me up in the air like I was a twig and threw me across the room. Then you started speaking in some crazy language," Joey said. "It was my fault," Rita said, her eyes full of tears. "Me and Angie asked the spirits to reveal themselves." None of this sparked any memories. "How do you know you weren't imagining things?" Joey laughed and looked down at his scar as he rebuttoned his shirt. "I had trouble sleeping with you in my room for a year after that. You have any idea what it was like keeping that secret?" A part of me wondered why they'd decided to break the news to me now. I looked over at Rita, hoping she would start laughing, but she was crying instead. "Okay, so you two, saved me from an evil spirit?" I asked sarcastically. Joey shook his head. "Nah, Mom and Dad came home." My father was not a man prone to superstitions, so I was surprised when Joey decided to bring him into the story. "And when he walked in, you started talking that crazy language, and then you started slinging Dad around the room like a wet noodle. he said, lighting a second cigarette. Joey laughed at the thought. I thought you were going to kill him, and that's when Mr. Payne walked in. I remembered Mr. Payne well. He always walked with a limp and was gardening in his backyard. We used to think it was funny that anyone had the last name Payne and that it would be perfect for a dentist, but he was a foreman at a factory. He heard the screams from across the street and came over to see what was wrong. Boy, did he ever get a surprise, Joey said. He was a good man, Rita said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. That thing started talking to him, and Mr. Payne started talking back in the same strange language. Joey was looking off in the distance. There's a lot you don't know about Mr. Payne. I couldn't help but think my siblings had watched The Exorcist one too many times. This is all unbelievable. I'm sorry. Did you know he studied to be a priest for 5 years and then gave it up when he met Mrs. Payne? Joey said, sitting on the porch rail. That's how he could speak to it. He studied those old languages. He started praying over you, and he asked Mom and Dad to get a priest, Rita added. I tried to envision Mr. Payne standing over me in prayer, but I couldn't hold the thought. All sounded so fantastical. There was a whole room full of them praying over you, all night long, Joey said. Every once in a while, we'd hear a ruckus, and Mr. Payne and it would start talking to each other again. So sorry, Rita said, reaching out to grab my hand. I've been wanting to tell you, God, for so long. It was strange, hearing a story about myself that sounded like a fairy tale. I knew the only way to find out if it was true was to ask Mr. Payne myself, but I wasn't even sure he was still alive. Is Mr. Payne still alive? I asked. Yeah, Joey said. He's over at the old folks' home. I saw him there when I went to Dad's birthday party a couple of years ago. I told my brother and sister that it was hard to believe, but if it did happen, I had no memory of it and forgave them for whatever it was worth. Seemed like it was important for them to hear that I forgave them, but it didn't sound like they'd done anything wrong. What I didn't tell them was that I planned to visit Mr. Payne tomorrow before my flight for California. I had a few hours in the morning, and given the circumstances, it seemed like the most rational thing to do. In retrospect, it was obviously not the wisest choice. That night, I sat in my hotel room trying to figure out why my siblings had come up with such a ridiculous story. They were both teenagers, and maybe they had misunderstood the situation. I might have lost my mind temporarily and then had a convulsion. Except the people praying over me all night long didn't seem to fit the story. But it was a small town with plenty of superstitious people. Wouldn't be the first time a group of well-meaning religious folks misdiagnosed a medical condition for a supernatural event. I woke up early the next morning and headed over to the nursing home. The last time I'd been to Hazelbuck Nursing Home was during my childhood. I would visit with my mom when my cousin was living there. My cousin had multiple sclerosis, and I remembered the place smelling bad, like Clorox. My cousin was always in good spirits and smiling, but I could never get over the smell of the place. To my surprise, the place had been completely renovated, and it even smelled better. There was a young lady in the front who greeted me. I asked if Mr. Payne was still a resident, and she asked me to sign in and pointed me towards room 144. I stood outside the room for a few moments. I still had time to turn around and head back to my normal, boring life in California. The radio was on, and I could hear Ernie Harwell doing a play-by-play announcement for the Tigers baseball game. Against my better judgment, I knocked on the door and heard a gruff voice say, "Door's open, come in." I walked in and saw Mr. Payne sitting in a recliner. He didn't look much different than I remembered him, but I could tell he was having trouble placing me. "It's Rich Thelen. You knew me as Richie," I said, smiling. Mr. Payne's demeanor changed immediately. It was as if he'd seen a ghost. I can come back another time if you..." No, it's fine. I just wasn't expecting to see anyone today." He pushed out a footrest. "Have a seat." I was suddenly uncomfortable. I guess I had half expected Mr. Payne to tell me it was just an overactive imagination, but judging from his reaction, I knew I wasn't going to like what he had to tell me. I thought about standing up and leaving. I'm sure he'd probably wonder why I showed up, but there was some doors that were just best to leave closed. This felt like one of those. I heard about your dad. You just never know how long you got until the bell tolls. It took me a moment to reorient myself. I'd completely forgotten that I'd been at my dad's funeral yesterday. Yeah, he always said he'd probably die of a heart attack. My grandpa was 45 when he died the same way. You mean Bill? I knew your grandpa. We used to hunt pheasant together. I didn't remember my grandpa. He died before I was born, so I didn't have anything to add. I'm really surprised to see you, Mr. Payne said, slapping me on the knee. You look good. Thank you, I said, realizing I could just make small talk and leave. I didn't need to open any locked doors. I could just shoot the breeze. So what brings you here? Mr. Payne asked. I came because I heard a crazy story, and I wanted to see if it was true. Mr. Payne ran his fingers through what was left of his gray hair. I figured that's why you were here. Mr. Payne looked over his shoulder. Can you get me some water? There's a cup next to the sink. I didn't know if that was a stall tactic or if he was preparing to give me a long speech, but I was happy to stand up and create some space between us. A few minutes later, I turned around with his water, and that's when I noticed he was holding a rosary. I handed him the water, and rather than sit back down, I took a couple of steps and leaned against the counter. I've tried to forget that night, Mr. Payne said, sipping from the styrofoam cup. You sure this wasn't just an overactive imagination? I asked. The old man lifted an eyebrow. Did they tell you what happened? What they could remember, yeah. Mr. Payne took a few more sips of water and thought for a long time. Well, they were just kids, so they probably didn't tell you everything. I waited for him to say something, but he just sat there in silence. I don't think he really wanted to discuss it. Mr. Payne, my brother said you dropped out of the priesthood. I did. Mrs. Payne was a nun back then, and I was going to be a priest, but nature decided otherwise. I laughed, even though it wasn't funny. Again, I contemplated abruptly walking out of the room. What you had in you was an old spirit, very old. It had come across the ocean from the old world, Europe. The language it spoke was Latin. None of this made any sense. Our house was old by the standards of the United States, but there was nothing ancient about it by European standards. Why would an old spirit live in our basement? I asked. Mr. Payne laughed. Is that what they told you, that it was in your basement? I nodded, surprised that there appeared to be a disagreement in their memories. Part of me hoped that the version I was about to hear was tethered in reality. It visited your basement because your sister and her friends called out to it, Mr. Payne said, his hand holding the rosary as it started to shake. I thought back to my brother telling me there was a lot of things I didn't know about Mr. Payne. That was suddenly starting to sound like an understatement. Then where did it come from? I asked. Mr. Payne's gaze went blank, and he started to mumble in a foreign language. That's when his eyes rolled back in his head and a smile crossed his face. The following words rolled out of his mouth in a thick Italian accent. Venit ex me. A moment later, his whole body began to shake. I pushed the nurse button next to the bed, still grounded in reality. I thought he was having a stroke. He was talking much clearer now, and I tried to remember it. Sponsium cum santa fide. And then I saw it with my own eyes. Black smoke, like tentacles, lifted out of his body and started taking the shape of a human. I was no longer in the nursing home. I was a petrified 7-year-old boy on the floor holding a toy soldier. Everything I had repressed came back in a terrifying moment. The cries, the prayers, and eventually being freed. With the last of his strength, Mr. Payne whispered, Serveti ipsum, serveti ipsum. and a moment later the shadows enveloped him and vanished. A caregiver eventually arrived a few minutes later. They said he was having one of his episodes and asked if I'd come back another day. I walked out of the nursing home and realized I'd reopened a door that Mr. Payne had locked with great difficulty and sacrificed 30 years ago. I didn't know the specifics of what Mr. Payne had done that night or what had happened in Rome that caused Mr. Payne to leave the priesthood, but something told me it was more than simply meeting his wife. A few months later, I looked up the meaning of those words. Mr. Payne was telling me he'd made a pact with the darkness, and then he told me to save myself. I pray every day to be spared the fate that Mr. Payne had. I also pray for his soul to be released, and perhaps most importantly, I make sure I keep the basement door well locked. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our spooky skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, and Queen Sheebah for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our ghostly writer tier contributor. Thanks everyone, we just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. my time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.